series. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Colin Palmer, who's actually going to be giving 2 talks during this series. I've got to put my hands up for advertising it as the Circumnavigation of Cooya, whereas it was an attempted circumnavigation, but much more of a story, which I've tried to dig myself out of the hole by explaining that in the email that everybody should have had the last 24 hours or so. So it's not about a circumnavigation, but I'm going to leave that to Colin to describe. The second talk, which I know Colin's going to just briefly introduce at the end of his talk this evening, is about the design of boats around the world and being a naval architect. I think that would be a fascinating talk as well. Colin's an engineer and naval architect whose day job at the moment is in the wind and solar industry. He lives on the Isle of Wight in the south of England. And like most OCC members, he says he's not really a club sort of person. So we're very honoured to have him giving a club type of talk tonight. So Colin, please go ahead.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everyone who's joined. I want to take you back to the 1970s, to a time when there was high inflation, there was sleaze in high places, and there was an energy crisis. You could ask, what's changed? Well, back then, we also had lava lamps, and perhaps most significantly, it was the dawn of accessible microprocessors. Small electronic gadgets were becoming available. It was before the days of PCs, but it was the beginning of that. And culturally, Pink Floyd, some of the music you could hear, and if you were really height of fashion for a man, you'd be wearing bell-bottoms. What about the yachting industry? I'm afraid this is a bit UK-centric because it's all I could do for research, but there is an advert for a Prout catamaran from 1972-ish. Of course, in black and white, because back then magazines were all in black and white. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that image. If you aspire to something bigger, you could look at a Nicholson 38, of its time, one of the larger cruising yachts available. There's a Nic 38. You possibly can't see all the text there, so let me zoom in on a little bit of the text to give you a cultural time. I talk about life on board, and then there's the in-between as a roomy wheelhouse, which converts into a marvelous sun trap by shedding its top. You can just imagine the young men in the marketing department guffawing about that line. Even on rough days, the 38 stays amazingly dry, and it gets worse. Right the way through, the 38 is beautifully equipped, which girls probably appreciate more than men, who wouldn't even realize what a difference a fabulous galley makes. The men were reduced to buying outboards for the dinghies. And one of the outboards you could buy in Britain back then was a British Seagull, invention of the devil, but they were very popular. Maybe there was nothing else. A Silver Century Plus with a clutch was £91. If you inflate that to today's prices, that's about 1,150 quid for something that didn't really start and spent its life stinking of petrol. Today, you can buy a 4-stroke air-cooled Honda, which starts when you pull the string, for 750 quid. If you couldn't afford an Nic 38 and you wanted a smallish, oh, by those standards, fairly large, but now we think of them as small family boat, this is the sort of thing you might have bought. A Westerly, a Pentland or Berwick, about 8 grand. Doesn't sound much now, but back then it was 5 or 6 times the average earnings in the country. And again, inflating it, 100,000 in today's money. I mean, today, most of the big series production companies hardly make boats that small. The starting size seems to be 35 feet these days, but a few do. And you can buy something like this. I think it's about 30 foot overall, but that is on the waterline and on the deck, unlike the Westerlies. And those, I think, and to a reasonable spec, cost about £85,000. Today in the UK, that's 3 times average earnings. That's only 3 times average earnings. So you can see that in that time, boats have become much more affordable. Anyway, against that context, two young men decided that they wanted to buy a boat and sail around the world. I was one of them. I had rather more hair back in those days. And the other that's on the left, was my good friend, Mike Yendall. Mike and I had met at Southampton University in the Yacht Research Group, and we discovered we had many things in common, one of which was a love of sailing. So we started, but neither of us had sailed much more than dinghies before, to be honest. And so we started to sail a bit with friends. And in the summer of 1972, we hitched a ride down to Falmouth. And there we are with in the Friends, or there's Mike at least, in the Friends Tumlaren. The Friend, the bear sitting on the wet rail there, is actually Steve Jones, who of course became a famous yacht designer later on. When we got to Falmouth, we borrowed another friend's boat and we sailed around for a couple of years and thought, a couple of months, and thought, this is rather fun. And neither of us had commitments to people or anything particularly. We were happy with our jobs, but we were happy also to consider giving them up. So we thought, maybe what we should do is sail around the world. And there the plot started. So that's the middle of 72. How were we going to do this? How were we going to finance it? That was one of the big issues. Well, we were lucky, both of us. We'd both bought houses. And this was the one I'd bought in 1971 in Southampton. And it cost me about £2,500, I think. Today, that house goes for about 380,000. Which again is interesting because that's 10 times the rate of inflation. So maybe I should have kept it. But I didn't because I needed to sell it to buy the boat in the end. And what we actually didn't really realize, but we lived through, was the Barber boom. We were lucky. In 72, or a bit before that, I think, the then Chancellor liberalized the financial markets to some extent, liberalized credit, and house prices predictably shot up. So between 72 and 74, when the oil crisis slowed things down, house prices in the UK at least, and I think in most of the rest of the developed world, shot up and more than doubled. So we were riding that bubble, both of us. So this was our plan. We'd hatched it in the middle of 72, had that idea, and we had two houses, and the plan was that we would spend 73 continuing to work, putting money aside and looking for a boat. Early 74, by then we'd have bought the boat. We recognized anything we bought would need some work, but we reckoned that would take about 6 months. So during 74, we would have a boat, one house, we'd sell one of the houses, and if you like, some money, 2 bags of money in the bank. And then towards the end of 74, we'd go on a milk run down to Canaries and head off into the sun. That was the plan. We thought we'd better find out a bit more about sailing, about big boat sailing. So we read the books. We read Motissier, we read Smeaton, of course, Hiscock, many others, and the somewhat salutary tale of the Robertsons survived the savage sea. So we got a pretty good, at least theoretical grounding of what could happen at sea and what it was like to go around the Horn. I don't know whether we ever really planned to do that, but we certainly wanted to understand what big sea sailing was about. So we'd read the books and we would try to use that to whatever we did to our boat. So we started scouring the press. And of course, back then, there weren't that many magazines. The key magazine was Yachting Monthly. And by the wonders of the internet, I've managed to get a copy of the very same edition in which we found this advert. Caledonian Yacht Services in Glasgow had a 16-ton auxiliary Bermudan yawl for sale. It's all in imperial units. She was 40.3 feet, 33 feet on the waterline, and unusually for a boat of her age, she was quite beamy, 11.6 feet beam and 6 feet of draft. Signed by a famous designer called Linton Hope. and built in teak. And those teak planks, it turned out, ran the whole length of the boat, most of them. Extraordinary that way you can, back then in 1914, when she was built, that you could get teak like that. She had a newish engine, a Perkins P6, tractor engine, marinized, and some new sails, and much new equipment besides. Well, as with all things, that was a bit of an overstatement, but never mind. We went up and had a look. She was £7,500. So again, back then, that was 5 times national earnings, or because of price inflation, about one of our houses, roughly. Today, again, scaling that up, that would be £100,000. What would you get for £100,000 today if you were 2 young men trying to do the same thing? Well, you could buy this rather fine aluminium cutter, probably truly ready to go or close to ready to go. Clearly, it's got radar and other things, and would have needed a great deal less work than it turned out Cooya needed. Because of the price inflation, that's less than a third of the cost of a house, average cost of a house in the UK, and only 3 times earnings. So again, you see, modern boats are much more financially accessible than they were back in the 70s. Anyway, we were where we were. We didn't know that all this was going to happen. And so we looked for, we went up and looked at Cooya. And there she is in the shed. She was copper sheathed. And in quite, quite sound. She'd been well looked after by Robertsons of Sandbank and stored properly, which is good for a wooden boat. But she was actually pretty crude and basic in many ways, even for her time, to be honest. But we had looked at some real lemons and were getting pretty desperate. And so she seemed to us to be what we wanted. This is a bit about her in her past. She was a gentleman's cruising yacht when she was originally built, gaff rigged, as you can see on the left there. And then subsequently, sometime in the 30s, we don't know exactly when, she was converted to the modern Bermudan rig on the right. This was not very good pictures, I'm afraid, but these are pictures of her when we got her. You can see that the previous owners had put this large deck house on. And in fact, one of the previous owners had been Tyler of Tyler Boat Company, besotted with fiberglass. He had covered the decks with fiberglass, which proved to be a mixed blessing. But there she is with her recent sales and the deck house. So that's the boat we bought. We had arranged a mooring for her and a mud berth in the Hamble. So that spring, we left the Clyde, delivered her down to her mud berth. And there she is, sat in the mud where she'd be for another 18 months or more, as it turned out. It's Mike having a thought about what it is we've actually bought and what we've let ourselves in for. And of course, one of the first things, because we'd read the books, was that the deck house had to go. That deck house was clearly vulnerable in a big sea, in a knockdown or anything. So we realized that that had to go. Also, as you've just seen, we also knew that the mast had to go. That's another story, and if there's time at the end, I'll tell you the story of the mast. Of course, the thing is that if you decide to lower the coach roof, you also have to lower the floor. And lowering the floor, in our case, meant taking out all the interior accommodation in the main saloon. So here's Mike having a look and thinking, oh, what have we done? What? Of course, it didn't take long to get it all out. And that was the result. You can see there that she's pretty solidly built. Look at those big wrought iron knees and the big frames. The frames were, well, the main frames were oak. I can't remember the smaller ones. Don't know whether they were oak or not. I can't remember now. But they were in pretty good condition. Some of the floors were a bit rough, so we replaced those. But the basic structure was good. And of course, those teak planks were almost perfect, as good as the day they were born. So that was the challenge. We didn't mess up quite so much of the more forward areas of the boat. We kept most of the existing galley on the starboard side there, pulled out something on the port side, but the mid cabin and the fore cabin, we did leave alone, thank goodness. But it was a lot of work, and a great deal of midnight oil was spent. And of course, I mean, this was back in the day, and also we were in a mud berth. There was no power there, no power at all. No, and so our lighting in the evenings was tilly lamps. And so here's Mike cutting into a new sheet of plywood by tilly lamp. This was the result eventually. Looks a bit better there. Remember that was all pulled out. And there's the refurbished galley area. And that's looking aft. And there's the original picture. So you can see there's a huge amount of work gone into that, of rebuilding that interior. Also, as I said, we put a new mast on her, and we've done a whole lot of other things. So there's masses and masses of work involved. One of the things I wanted to do in this talk was contrast how it was then to how it is now. And I've done that a bit financially, but also there's other big changes that occurred. One of the things was we had to stick all that joinery together with resorcinol glue. It's a sort of horrible black or purpley jam-like material that you stick between the wood. It doesn't fill gaps. It's very fussy about the pressure you apply to it and the temperature. You have to get it dead right. Once it's done and cured, it's a very, very good glue, totally impervious to water and everything else, but a very fussy adhesive to use in a job like this. If we had had epoxy resin, life would have been a great deal easier. Not only that, but if we'd had electric power tools, battery power tools, we could have charged them with solar power during the day, because to begin with, we'd kept one of the houses and we were living there. Ultimately, we rented it out to give us an income, but for quite a while we were doing the major work, we weren't living on the boat. We could have charged the tools up at night, taken them down to the boat the next day. We had a Honda generator, but starting it up was difficult, it was noisy. So if you needed to drill just 1 or 2 holes, you didn't start the generator, we couldn't leave it running all day. You drilled them by hand. So we drilled holes by hand, we sawed by hand. Everything took a very, very long time. So what was the outcome of all this? Well, there's our original plan. We actually spent nearly 18 months or more doing that level of refit, and it still wasn't finished. And of course, we'd burnt through some money. So we still had the house, which we'd let out to generate some income. We had a boat, of course, but only, if you like, 1 bag of money now, not quite as much. But we decided that we would carry on. We had all the tools on board. We obviously knew what we were doing in terms of fixing the boat at least. So we thought, well, what we'll do is we'll set off. We'll sail down to Falmouth. Maybe then we'll do a shorter hop across to Spain and gradually build up, working on the boat as we go along. And here we are a day or 2 before we left, dried out on the hard in the Itchen. Now I am with my brother, and we were, I think actually we just changed the keel bolt. I think that's what that excavation is under the boat. Then after that, we redid the anti-fouling and a few other jobs, checked propeller, and we were ready to go. And there we are the day we left. Some friends had come to see us, they're just reversing away, and then we went. What about equipment? Well, back then, for safety, we had this thing, a call buoy. What was it? 115 pounds, I think, well, 100 pounds or so. Well over £1,000 today. I think basically a VHF. It offered all sorts of things, but I'm sure it wasn't very good at when you were far out to sea. Today, of course, we'd have a satellite phone, we'd have an EPIRB, we'd have a VHF with DSC. Things have moved on. Waterproofs. This was state-of-the-art waterproofs in the early 70s. Breathable wasn't a word that anyone, well, not in relation to waterproofs that anyone had come across. And note, no lifelines, harness, and no life jacket. Today, of course, the situation is very, very different. navigation, finding a way, and things like that. Well, we had this radio. Fortunately, Mike was a bit of a radio ham, and he bought this radio for the boat, which I never really got to grips with fully. It used to whistle and scream a lot, but we did pick up some various signals with it, so it was useful. We didn't have masthead instruments or anything. We just had a handheld anemometer and ocean passages of the world to plan where we were going to go and when, and of course pilot charts. Today, in terms of wind planning and things, of course, you've got things like predict wind, you've got passage weather, windy, you've got Navtex. You can get good, solid 4 or 5 day forecasts, reasonable forecasts out to 2 weeks sometimes, depends how settled the weather is. So it's not a matter of looking at the sky, licking your finger and deciding, yeah, well, maybe we'll go. Now you can sit and plan it in great detail. In terms of actual navigation, we had a C-fix, another invention of the devil, but better than nothing, I guess. There's a hand-bearing compass there for speed. We had to tow a log. We didn't have any other sort of log. We had a seafarer echo sounder, a sextant, of course, the Admiralty pilots. And one thing we treated ourselves to was an electronic calculator. We thought, well, this will, if we get tired, it'll help with the doing the sights and sight reduction, which we knew by then because we'd learned how to do it, was a tedious process. And I can't track down the cost of that at the time, but it's probably around about £1,000 in today's money, that little calculator. They give them away now. But we felt it was a worthwhile investment. What would you have today? Well, of course, there's all the Royal Cruising Club and others, many other very high quality pilots. There's plotters, there's iPad navigation, and of course there's GPS. So many things have GPS on them. Your phone has GPS, your VHF has GPS. It's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. So long as the satellites stay in the air, you know where you are. You've got AIS and radar. None of these things were available back then. In terms of the machinery on the boat, we had, as I said, a Perkins P6 diesel, designed originally for tractors. I think it had been well marinized. It was a good job. The batteries were standard wet lead acid batteries, and the only real way of telling their state was with a hydrometer. You could get voltmeters, but they weren't that accurate back then. And so it was quite difficult to figure out the state of the batteries until the lights in the boat started to go dim. And I don't remember for sure, but I'm pretty certain we didn't have any separation between the batteries. We just had a bank of batteries and we used them for starting or for service. Today, of course, that's an anathema. And today, people have all sorts of different charging, wind chargers, solar, of course, towed chargers, lots of ways of generating electricity on board, and at least in terms of lighting, much lower consumptions. LED bulbs have made a huge difference. Now, I know that there are many other gizmos people have which chomp through the electricity, but if you have a boat to the same sort of specification as Cooya, which is just a few radios and lights, you can do it with so much less consumption these days. And of course, you know what's going on with your batteries, and you have splitters for charging. So you don't run down all the batteries and find you can't start the engine, because you certainly can't hand start a Perkins P6 like that. And you have battery monitors. That whole thing of energy management on a yacht is so much more sophisticated today. In terms of sail handling, she had roller reefing on the main. Looks very nice on that classic yacht there, but how do you put a kicking strap on it when you're rolling downwind in a big sea? We jibed a couple of times, when we shouldn't have done, perhaps partly because the boom was up and down. Okay, we could possibly put something from the end of the boom, but it was a very, very long, slender boom. It was problematic, that idea. And of course, the sail doesn't actually reef very well. As you reef it in, you have to keep stuffing sail bags in or something to take the slack out. It's all a lot of hassle. And the same with the headsails. The headsails were attached with sail hanks. Now on a small inboard headsail, there may well be a very good case for those, but we had a big Genoa out on the end of the bowsprit. You had to slacken that off, and pulling that down off the thing was a big job. Now, of course, you have two-line reefing, roller reefing. But against all that, we headed off. And here's Cooya with a bone between her teeth, heading off. I don't know where that was taken, but it's a rather fine shot of her under full sail. And you can see there the sail hanks and so on. We went down across Biscay to northern Spain, and then we thought, well, we'll go down to Gibraltar. The pilot charts of the time show these big arrows from the north. So we had visions of a really nice run down the coast of Portugal. We beat the whole way. And you can see there, I mean, it wasn't that strong, the wind, force 3 to 4, but it turned up a lumpy old sea, and we discovered that beating was certainly not Cooya's best point of sail. At one point, we put a wave into that big low-clewed jib and had to blew it out and had to repair it. We learnt a lot on that trip down. And eventually came round the corner and into Gibraltar in the days when you could tie up alongside the wall in jib. What I haven't told you is that the strain of overrun on time and various other things have put a huge strain on our relationship. And Mike and I realized, sadly, that we weren't going to go around the world together. This just wasn't going to work. And we came to that conclusion sitting in Gibraltar and decided that we would split up. He wanted to go back to England to see his girlfriend. And what we arranged was that I would stay with the boat and bring her back to England that winter. And then we'd had time to cool off. We would decide what we were going to do next. So I set about sorting the boat out a bit. I painted her and did various other things and found some crew because we'd not got the self-steering gear working. It turned out to be an extremely difficult job because there was so much friction in the steering system on the boat that a conventional self-steering gear like we'd designed just wouldn't work. So we just dragged that thing around for no reason. And anyway, back then, I certainly didn't feel confident enough to sail single-handed, and Cooya's not really a boat to sail single-handed. She has a nice slow motion, but she's hard to sail, lots of big, heavy loads. So the plan was head out from Gibraltar, down to Madeira, up to the Azores and back to England. And Gibraltar's a place where people seem to come through, so there's a continual stream of people coming through. And so I was able to find some people who wanted to come with me. And off we went. We went into Funchal to check in to Madeira, and then went down to Mashiko Bay. And there is Cooya anchored in Mashiko Bay. I show you that picture because, and that's my chart of how to get in, because I'm interpreting very poor quality, I think they're American charts we were using, but there's Mashiko Bay today. There's a marina in the corner. So where those rocks and things are shown on my chart, there's one now coming in a bit further, there's a marina. So we could have sat in that marina. Because in Mashiko Bay, we rolled. We discovered another of the problems of Cooya was more than many boats, she rolled. And so we sat there rolling and rolling and rolling with it driving us mad. We tried flopper stoppers and other things, but it didn't make much difference. So after a couple of days of that, I thought we've got to get out of here. Let's go down to the deserted islands, Ilhas Desertas, which are southeast of Mashiko Bay. Headed off down there, and there's Cooya anchored off the anchorage and those islands. Again, this was using Admiralty pilot. Not many people, the Admiralty obviously went there because it was very, very vague about where you anchored and things like that. And this was my sketch chart from the time. We probably went, I don't remember now, we probably went in and did various soundings and thought about it for a very long time till we finally decided where to anchor. Today, there's an extract from the pilot book. tells you exactly where to anchor. We were too far south. And of course, you've also got Google Earth. And those are the people in the cat there, and others have found the right spot to anchor. The pin shows where we anchored in quite deep water. So we had a lot of chain out. But it was a really fascinating place. We had a nice stay there. The wind was blowing across the island, and there were quite big gusts coming down our side. And I just remember one night there, just spending the whole night really struggling to sleep because the boat was thrashing backwards and forwards on the anchor. And then I discovered the problems with a bobstay. Because the anchor chain would catch around the bobstay, and actually halfway along the bobstay there was a join. So the anchor chain would slide up there, catch, and then there'd be a huge bang as it released itself as she sheared around, and really hard to sleep. We were anchored on a CQR. That was what we had, not a 20-pound one, admittedly, somewhat bigger than that, but we had a CQR anchor. We also had a big fisherman's, that I don't think we ever used. What would I use today? Well, I would use a spade anchor, possibly a Rockner, but certainly a spade anchor. And the other thing, of course, it's so obvious now, is I would put nylon strops onto the anchor chain. You can see that sensible yacht has done that there. It would have saved all that hassle overnight. And I was learning, I guess. I hadn't sailed much. I hadn't sailed big boats. I didn't think about it. You know, what you did, I was told, was you put the anchor chain out and hung on to it. And it was 3 or 4 times water depth. That's what you did. It didn't occur to me to put a line on it and hang on the nylon. You learn as you go along, eh? Why would I choose those anchors? Well, because science says that they're better. This is some study of holding power. Don't worry about what their vertical scales mean, but essentially they mean the holding ability of the anchor. Across the bottom, you've got a CQR there, and then over here, you've got the spade and the Rockner. And you can see they've got nearly 3 times the holding power. So for the same weight of anchor, you've got 3 times the holding power. And by accounts I've read and my own experience, they also set a great deal quicker and better. But we didn't know that again, so we stuck with the CQR and we headed off to the Azores. Our point of entry was Santa Maria, and we went into Villa de Porto, I guess. I mean, I don't remember all this. It's just paperwork, I guess, back then. I must have checked into the country and done all that. And then we thought, well, let's go around to San Lorenzo Bay. It looks like a nice spot. It was supposed to be, it is a very beautiful place. And off we went. And there you can see a Google Earth picture of San Lorenzo Bay. And what maybe isn't apparent is that all around there are vineyards going up the hills. It's a beautiful place. I was obsessed with rolling. We'd had such a miserable time in Madeira that I really wanted to find somewhere we could anchor out of the swell. So as we came into the bay, the swell I don't think was quite as much as there is there. It was probably more from the south than it is there, coming up from the south. I had got fixated on this idea that if I got into that bottom corner of the bay, we'd be out of the swell. And this is, you know, it's a real lesson of not to fixate on one thing. I thought, I really don't want to sit there in this rolling again. I've got to find an anchorage that's out of the swell. So we've got to get into that corner. So we were motoring fairly slowly into that corner, getting, you know, close to the shore. And I was still fixated. There were still waves, when suddenly the waves started to peak. And I realized we were almost in the breaker zone. The waves weren't actually breaking, but you know how they start to really pile up as they get into shallow water. And I can still, as I'm saying this, I can feel my heart beating. I was absolutely petrified. I managed to turn around before we were on the beach and motored out through these now pretty much breaking waves and got her into deeper water. What a stupid thing to do. I'm an engineer, I'm a naval architect. I should understand about wave refraction. And yet I'd forgotten it. I just got obsessed with this idea of finding a corner out of the swell. But wave refraction makes sure that waves get round the corner. Whew. You live and learn, eh? Anyway, we rolled a bit there, but we went ashore and had a nice time. Went back to Via de Porto, where we met some locals. And the locals said, do you fancy going snorkeling? And we know a just fantastic place on the island where you can go snorkeling. We go up there all the time. You know, we know it really well. We'll take you up there. So yeah, a bit of local knowledge. Wow, let's do that. Next mistake coming up. So we headed off. We went to Bahia dos Anjos in the northwest of the island. And here it is on a modern chart. Charts we had weren't at this level, and they didn't show all those rocks. And here is a photograph of the bay as well, and you can see rocks. We didn't know that. So we were motoring in with the local person saying, yeah, this is fine, yeah, we're doing fine, get a bit further in, I know just the spot to go snorkeling. When I sort of looking around, looked over the side and saw rock heads going past. As I saw those, we hit one. We were doing 3 or 4 knots, because about the slowest you could make Cooya go under power, unless you kept putting the clutch in and out, was 3 or 4 knots. There was this enormous bang, and we hit this rock. Calm, flat calm, no reason to hit it whatsoever, but the fact I was following local knowledge. Reversed her off, of course, turned around, got heading out to sea, got one of the people on board to steer out to sea, dived down below, pulled up floorboards, nothing, no water. Well, no more than usual. There was always water in the bulge, but no new water, nothing. Pulled up more floorboards, nothing. So my heart rate dropped a bit. We went out a bit further and we stopped the engine and just drifted, put a snorkel on, went over the side and went down. And you know, she had a lead keel, and towards the front of the keel, it just looked like someone had got their hand and pulled out a great handful of lead. But the worrying thing was it exposed the head of one of the keel bolts. So I was a bit worried about that. So I thought, well, we've got to fix that. So we went to Horta, the only place we were told that they had a crane big enough to lift her out. And there she is alongside the quay in Horta. And of course, you know, as you know, you can't do that anymore, I don't think. It's all marinas and stuff. But we sat there and they lifted her out. And this ancient crane lifted her out. The guy brought her over, put her on those wooden blocks, put the clutch in on the crane and went home. So there she was, hung, no props, just sitting on the wooden blocks, relying on the clutch on the crane. Boy, did I need a drink. Yeah, and you can see there where the lead has been gouged out. And you can just see those whitish marks on her there. But it wasn't too bad, in fact. And we had everything on board. We had spare keel bolts. So I changed the keel bolt, as you do. And of course, now if it's an Ovni, this is my older Ovni, the one I had previously, it's really rather easier getting them up and down out of the water. So the time came to go home. It was getting late, actually. It was getting into September. We perhaps left it a bit too late, but the pilot chart said the chance of a gale was 10 or 20% on the way back. Winds all over the place, no real predominant wind direction, but thought, well, okay, let's give it a go. And of course, back then, you know, we were probably looking at forecasts a day ahead at most. So basically, trip that length, unless it's blowing a gale when you leave, you just go. So we went, and it blew. It quickly blew up. We had a lot of force 5, 6. Fortunately, a lot of it from quartering and from astern. So we made some, you know, quite good speed, but still, of course, steering by hand. And then the weaknesses of the boat started to show up. On the bow, we had as well as that big Genoa, we had a brown high crude sail on a Wickham Martin, which is another invention of the devil to my mind. It was, the forerunner of modern proper furling gears, but it kept dropping its turns. And so I would have to get out on the bowsprit in those sort of conditions and re-reeve the turns around the thing to make it work. It also one day decided to snap its lashing. And so we had the whole sail and the Wickham Martin thrashing around to leeward. And before we got it under control, it had contrived to put a hole in the mainsail. I mean, we had a sewing machine, so we fixed it, but another thing to do. And then the steering wire snapped. You can see Pat there steering and on the steering wheel, and bad design, not us, I hasten to add, the original people who redesigned the boat. The steering wires went round some very small pulleys, and one of them snapped in the middle of the night. So we had to rig the emergency tiller, and we had spare wires and fix that in those conditions. And the log started playing up. There must have been some friction in it. I took it to bits 2 or 3 times, but I couldn't find out what it was. It would stop, and then put a lot of turns onto the string, and then suddenly it would free up and whiz off. It actually seemed to be adding it all up and giving a reasonable distance, but it was a bit worrying. And the compass light went out, and it was connected by solder. So there I was in those conditions with a soldering iron. And she leaked. This we hadn't realized because we'd hardly had any water on deck up to then, and a bit of rain. But there's a huge difference, as we all know, between rain and a big wave coming on deck. Boy, did she leak everywhere. We had water in the chart table, water through the hatches. Life became pretty unpleasant. And the weather, it started to deteriorate further. Because of that radio, we were able to pick up forecasts by this point, and the forecast of 24th of September was Plymouth southwest 6 to 8, maybe 9, Seoul 7 to 9. And if you go on MetCheck, you can actually find a place where they recreate weather charts from any date you give them. So there we are in the weather chart in 24th September. You can see this at the bottom of the compression in the isobars. And then they came south, and that hit us, and we got through that all right, and things calmed down a bit, and then a little sneaky low shot through. So we got hit twice. Difficult to know what the wind speeds were. We were measuring with this thing. The graph shows how wind speed varies with height. We were measuring at about 2 or 3 meters. I saw 40 knots on it. So that's probably equivalent to 50 knots at 10 meters, which is the height that normally wind speeds are quoted at. So, a reasonable wind. Here's an extract from the log, the emergency tiller rigged, and this is 26th. The 10:30, all sails down, log stop, lying a hull, and 30 knots the wrong way. The wind had briefly gone round to the southeast. Don't quite know why. This is the entry from my log, not my personal log. Okay, what should I be doing? It's blowing 30 knots from the east, and going to windward in that was diabolical. So I've dropped the whole bloody lot, put Mozart on the tape, and poured a glass of Azores wine to remind me of why I'm here. And the compass light's backed up again. That could be serious. Then optimistically, I think the wind is moderating. It didn't. Overnight it blew up, and at 6 o'clock the following morning it was gusting 50 knots. It did moderate later that day. And here we are, hove to. Oh, the Wickham Martin had failed again in the middle of the night, and the sail blew out. I don't know whether you've ever had that happen to you, but the noise is indescribable. I mean, that sail, it blew out in a few seconds. So it couldn't have been at night. It must have been during the day, because I remember watching it happen. The control line must have chafed through, and this thing just peeled out, and within seconds it was shredded. And the noise, and there's nothing I could do about it because I couldn't get it down, because the sheets went through bullseyes on the deck, and the knots were hard up against the bullseyes. And anyway, what was the point? It wasn't doing any particular harm except keeping her head off the wind, perhaps. But the noise got very, very debilitating. Oh, and then in my personal log, this entry, also we got knocked down last night to maybe 90 degrees. Some water below and a few things spilt, but no other damage. Don, that was one of the crew, reckons he saw me hanging horizontally across the saloon, but my recollection is rather vague. So why did we get knocked down? I mean, it was blowing 40, 50 knots. It hadn't been blowing for that long, so I don't know what size the waves were, but they certainly weren't Southern Ocean waves, sort of autumn North Atlantic, but they weren't that massive. Well, there's now a lot of science about this. That yacht there, if that had been a few boats' lengths to windward, would have been hit by that breaking wave, and they would be feeling a great deal less comfortable than they are at the moment. Here's what I think is a very good source of information, the Morgan's Cloud website, and they report on this whole thing and reckon that rogue waves are not bad luck. It's a matter of being it's bad luck in the sense of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but rogue waves are always there. A 3 meter significant sea, which isn't that big, regularly has 6 meter waves. And after the Fastnet race, there was a whole lot of work done on capsize of boats. And the work showed that a breaking wave, if you get caught beam on to a breaking wave of just half the length of your boat, you will be capsized. Whatever the boat, deep keel, shallow keel, whatever, you will most likely be capsized. So that's the question of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not a freak wave, it's just that you happen to be sitting on that wave as it broke. So this is theoretical for me, but what would I do today? I would have a Jordan stroke. All I've read, and there may well be people in this audience who have other views, I don't know. I'm sure many of you have sailed a great deal more than I have in these sort of conditions, but it seems to me that there's a lot of logic in a Jordan stroke. A couple of days later, we were moored in Falmouth, and boy, was I pleased to be home. Very quickly now, let me tell you what happened to Cooya. Mike and I split up in the sense we went our separate ways. The deal was Mike kept Cooya, and he sailed her a huge amount. He went up to Iceland, the picture at the top there, around Croatia, and many, many other places. And I'm pleased to say that we did become friends again. We, I think, never thought we could sail long distance for months at a time together, but certainly for a few weeks, the old spirit was there. And here we are, I don't know where we were, but sailing together. And because of that, I got to sail to Libya. We went round the Black Sea. We went into Sebastopol, Balaclava. We did the Baltic. I did Biscay with him to help him deliver the boat several times. I did a lot of sea miles with him, which was wonderful. So we were really starting to rekindle our relationship. And Cooya got to her 100th birthday. There she is, dressed overall in London. And that's how she was when she was much, much older. And I even got Mike sailing on the Ovni I had at the time. We went to the Scilly Isles, and there he is on the right there. And in fact, he'd become a convert to Ovnis and was beginning to realize that Cooya had her for long enough, and started to think, well, it's time to get something else. And he very much had in mind to get an Ovni. And then sadly, on the 10th of June, 2017, he died. Very quick. It was bowel cancer. I won't read you all it says there, but I lost a very dear friend. And without him, I would never have done all this. He had a drive and determination, a stubbornness maybe, which is perhaps partly at the root of why we ultimately couldn't get on, but it was his drive and determination that made it happen. So I'd just like to leave you with a picture that sums up Mike to me. There he is, down in the engine room, fixing the engine on Cooya. He was a wonderful engineer, a consummate fixer, and a great person to sail with. I was completely trusted him. I never slept better than when Mike was on the helm. So thank you everyone for your time. It's very strange talking to a completely silent audience, but I hope you've enjoyed it.
Mike, Colin, we certainly have enjoyed it immensely. It's a fantastic tour de force right the way through from 1970s yachting magazines, which were extraordinary. Cringe-makingly extraordinary. Amazing. Yeah. And I mean, we always think that sailing is like super expensive. which it is, but judging it historically, it must have been super expensive in the 1970s.
Yes, I must admit, I was really surprised when I did that. I mean, I knew that we were struggling a bit financially, but I didn't realize quite how much more expensive boats were back then. But I suppose when you think now, a starter boat is 40 foot. You know, people go out, they go to, and that's where they start. Boats are obviously financially much more accessible. Marinas are full of them. After all, there weren't marinas, well, very few marinas back then.
Yeah. I'm just going to, before people, the floor is open. So if anybody who has tuned in, and we've got 150 people online at the moment, wants to ask any questions, please put your electronic hand up. You're getting some comments coming up now, Colin. I don't know if you can see them.
How do you want me to do this? Shall I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, you can stop sharing the screen. That would be good.
I mean, what I might do is very quickly, this is the sort of thing that you'll see in the next talk. These are some boats I worked with in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, and this is Cambodia. So what I'll be doing is talking about those sort of boats and why they're the shape they are, how they've evolved, and where they're going in the future. So there we go.
Thank you very much, Colin. You've got the. I don't think there's anything on the Q&A. It's all in the chat line. So if you open the chat box, you'll see what people have been. There's no questions on there as such. I don't think at the moment. We've got a hand up. Let me go to.
All right.
Oh, the hand up is just it's Clive. Where's it gone? It's come and gone.
Lots of very kind remarks, but
yeah, lots of kind remarks.
I'm interested that no one is challenging my views on anchors and things like that.
Everybody always challenges views on anchors.
Exactly.
I'm sure that. So I've asked Charles to open his microphone. Charles, do you want to go ahead? You had your question. You had your hand up. I'll also ask.
Someone wants to know about the aluminium boat.
So do you want to, just while these guys are getting their microphones sorted out, Colin, do you want to talk about the aluminium?
Can I ask a question of the audience? I mean, I've sailed quite a few miles, but that trip back from the Azores was the most serious weather I've ever been in, which, you know, for many, I'm sure in the audience is very commonplace. What do you think I did wrong? I mean, I did what the book said at the time, which is to lie a hull. This was the recommendation at the time in those sort of conditions, to lie a hull. We now know, at least the theory says, it was the most stupid thing to do. Do other more experienced people share that view?
One of the talks we've got programmed is actually on it's not actually advertised yet, but it's on the Jordan series stroke. So I think there's a couple of people who've got microphones open. I'm going to go to Clive Reeves first of all. Clive, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, can you hear me, guys?
Yes, loud and clear, Clive. Go ahead.
I would just like to say that I had a great pleasure of not only meeting Mike, but he did a talk for me. You may not know me, but I was at the 2012. I was cruising secretary of the Clyde Cruising Club, and
right.
Mike did a talk for me about Dowie, the dinghy section in Glasgow.
Right.
And we had a fantastic talk, and of course Cooya used to sit off the Royal Northern.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That's right. So I got to know Mike, and it was funny when I saw the talk tonight in Cooya. I said, "Goodness, I remember that name." And so it was a great pleasure meeting Mike, and he did a talk. It was a Mediterranean, and I think it was he went to some quite hairy places.
Yeah.
And they did a talk, and it was just fantastic to hear about some of the experiences to travel that far, and a very old boat I may add.
Yeah.
You were very brave to do all.
In retrospect, at the time, it seemed the obvious thing to do. But yes, I think you're right, actually. Or stupid.
Yes, I like to comment about, leaking in hatches, etc. But yes, I can just imagine the experiences. There's things that you can't replicate, can you? And it's just fantastic to hear your experiences. And as I say, Mike sadly died very young.
Yeah.
And it was just a pleasure to host him at one of my lectures. In fact, this year I'm still doing the lectures for the Clyde Cruising Club in Glasgow. We've got Ian Nicholson, who's 93.
Yes, well, Ian surveyed Cooya for us.
You know Ian, yes.
So, yeah.
Well, Ian and I we both have the same type of boat. So
okay.
So he's been great. But thank you very much. That was a great talk tonight. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. Ari Wilkes, your microphone is open, so please go ahead.
Hello, Simon and Colin. It's Andrew and Maura Wilkes. Colin, an absolutely fantastic talk. We really enjoyed it. It was brilliant. Thank you. I just wanted you to say a few words, perhaps with your naval architect's hat on, about the difference in hull design and keel shapes and things. Cooya was a very traditional deep displacement boat, yes, with a very heavy long keel and different stability curves and things from yes, from the Ovni. Is that a big advance? And perhaps you just say a few words. Thank you.
Well, advance. I mean, they're such different boats. I mean, yes, Cooya, when you do the stability calculations, her maximum righting moment is at about 90 degrees of heel. So when we were knocked down, there was a lot of lead bringing us back upright again. But that long keel meant that she was very poor to windward, a lot of wetted area. So her, her sailing performance was not that good. And she, but she was, as I say, she was fairly beamy for her time. So she was quite stiff. The Ovni, yes, the ultimate stability is less. I've fortunately never had to put that to the test. I'm told that if you pull the plate up, and they will survive those sort of conditions. I don't know, to be honest. I've fortunately not had, but if you read Jimmy Cornell and people like that who have sailed Ovnis to high latitudes, they don't have any concerns about them at all. But on paper, they are less stable than something like Cooya. But equally, because of Cooya's construction and the way she was, if we'd turned her upside down, she probably would have sunk before, or she'd have got an awful lot of water in very quickly, because you just can't really seal a boat like that. So to that extent, under the most extreme conditions, she would have flooded very seriously, very quickly. Whereas in theory, something like a aluminium boat, you can seal the hatches and be pretty secure upside down for however long it takes till it comes back up again. So they're not very naval architecture sort of words, but that's how it seems to me. Sorry, does that answer your question?
It does, Colin. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I mean, we've got a very big Cooya type hull, which we feel very stable on.
Yes.
But I can certainly see the advantages of an Ovni, and lots of people sell them very successfully. So,
well, yeah, it's also really nice not dragging 6 feet of keel around. And I mean, and the other thing is that one of the reasons I love having an Ovni, and this may be a bit cavalier, is that if you have a boat like Cooya and you make a mistake coming into somewhere and you touch the bottom and you can't get off, you're going to lean over to 50, 60 degrees. You possibly will flood as you do it, you might not. You're almost definitely going to do some damage to the top sides as you do that, unless you're lucky, unless you've done it on sand. It's not something that you want to do or that you're going to get out of lightly. If you do that in an Ovni, no problem. I mean, unless a swell comes up and you're going to bang a bit as you come off again. But if you do make a mistake like that, unless you're on rocks, you're going to be fine. You're going to dry out upright and wait for the next tide. So it means I can go places and get into places I wouldn't dream of going in a boat like Cooya, which for the sort of sailing I want to do these days is for me a huge advantage.
Thank you. I can quite see that. And do you feel that the drop keel or a lifting keel is vulnerable at all?
I haven't found it so. I mean, people talk about, oh, you get stones in the keel box and all that sort of thing. Touch wood, it's never happened. The keel itself goes up and down easily enough. They're accessible. You can get access to them from above without, with the boat afloat. Obviously, you can't take the pin out, but you can look down inside. The way they're designed, it's all fairly easy to get at. And you can you could change the pivot pin on a tide, and the actual rope system for pulling it up and down again is accessible and can be changed with the boat afloat. So I don't think, I may live to regret saying this, but up to now I haven't had a problem with it.
That's great. Many thanks, Colin, and thank you again for a really fascinating talk. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Andrew, do you want to, as you've got a classic boat, do you want to come back to Colin's question about heavy weather tactics and Jordan series drogues, etc.?
Yes, certainly. We were going offshore, and we contacted the manufacturer or one of the manufacturers of Jordan's drogues and asked them about whether it would be a good idea for us to have one. And because we're 40 tons, and he said we're sort of we were just a bit beyond the specification for what he thought was necessary. So we tend to just rely on our huge lump of lead and reduce sail and put the kettle on.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for brute force, I think, at times. I mean, it obviously is your size and your mass relative to the waves. And I guess what I perhaps should have done was to have hove to, so that the bow was, but I think that was part of the problem, was I think that headsail had blown out. I'm trying to remember all this, it's a long time ago. Maybe because the headsail had blown out, there wasn't much else I could do other than to have run off, which, with hindsight, maybe we should have done.
We had a similar situation once when we were in a gale and on a different boat, but we had a bowsprit and but a modern roller furling headsail on it, and the reefing line snapped. And the only thing we could think of to do was to take everything down apart from the headsail, because the bowsprit was either in the water or out of the water, and all we could do was just run downwind with this great big sail.
Wow.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Well, as I say, ours blew out before I could even get a sheet on it. That was the trouble. The sheets, just as it came out, the sheets shot forward, and they were just so dangerous on the foredeck, leaping around. You couldn't, you couldn't get a line on them and put a rolling hitch on and pull them back to a winch or anything like that. It was a real object lesson in the power of the wind.
Mm. Thank you, Andrew. We've got a question from Pat Murphy, who I think is calling from Southern Ireland. Pat, go ahead.
Colin, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. My late wife and I set off to do a 4-year circumnavigation.
Mm-hmm.
And you people are very intelligent, and you can tell me whether this is good planning or bad planning. But we managed to stretch the 4 years into just over 9 years, right? But just a couple of points on it. We always used a snubber on our anchor chain, and we didn't have any noise at all, and that worked out very well. We also had 2 bow anchors, which we had to use at times. But a more important one was we had an aluminium stern anchor, which I could row out in the dinghy because it's very light, and pull the stern into the waves coming in on it. And that proved very, very successful. Now, we did have the hove too, going down the Tasman Sea to New Zealand and everything else on it. And we did have a drogue, but I only had to use the drogue once. But we thoroughly enjoyed it. And but it was good planning or bad planning. We stretched the 4 years to just over 9 years. Of course, she died some years ago, but we had a marvelous, marvelous time, and we did 39,000 miles.
Whoa.
And so it was really, so listen, Colin, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed your talk.
Well, thank you, Pat. Yeah, and I learned my lesson. I think maybe I didn't explain it properly, but I said in the talk that now I would have put strops or what's the word, bits of nylon line onto
Snubber, snubber, yeah.
Snubber, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I do now with the Ovni. In fact, I've got a mixed anchor rode as well. So I've got 30 meters of chain and 60 meters of nylon. And equally, like you, I've got a stern anchor and do the same. You learn as you go along.
You do. And well, lucky enough now we did manage to put in a forward facing echo sounder. And that was very handy going through the reefs.
I can imagine, yes.
Found that very handy on it.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks everybody. I thoroughly enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Good to hear your voice again. There's a few more that had their hands up, I think, who can open their microphones. Alan Critchlow, Charles Stark, and Stephen Feltzner. If any of you three want to open your mics, go ahead. We'll just wait on that. There's a few things on the Q&A while we're waiting for those.
Someone's asking about the mast. I can tell them about that.
Do you want to take the questions there, Colin? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just share the screen again, just to tell you a little bit about the mast, if you like. Right, there we go. Let's just, we can stick with that. Yeah, when we were delivering the boat down from Scotland, we were coming out of Holyhead and changing sails, and we managed to get the halyard round the upper spreader, pulled the spreader out, which was bad enough. We threw her over on the other tack immediately. When we looked up, we could see that the top part of the mast was moving independently of the rest. So I went up the mast and discovered that the mast had been fiberglass sheathed, part of the obsession with fiberglass. Someone had drilled a hole in it at some point and water had got in, and we subsequently discovered that the wood inside was like a sponge. Anyway, we managed to get the boat down to Southampton without breaking it further, but obviously that mast had to go. We discovered that the mast off British Steel, Terry Blythe's boat, was available for sale in Portsmouth. And so we managed to buy that. And noticed that it was a very strange, elongated oval shape. And at that time, I knew a few people in the yachting industry, and I managed to get an introduction to Robert Clark, and that's Robert Clark on the right there. And he agreed to meet us in his flat in London. So Mike and I went up to meet Robert Clark. And he is a very polite gentleman, invited us in, we chatted about this and that, and got through quite a lot of claret. And eventually Mike and I plucked up courage to say to him, could you tell us, Mr. Clark, why you chose that cross-section for the mast? And we expected to get some sort of answer in terms of moments of inertia and things. And he looked us in the eye and he said, I thought it was a nice shape. Don't you agree? More claret. That was the end of all we were going to find out about the mast. But the issue with the mast was it was massive. It was too big for the boat. We got all the rigging as well, which was massive. And what we didn't know about at the time was pitch inertia. Is that if you have, a weight like that, I mean, it didn't affect the stability of the boat very much because she was so solid, but it did affect the pitch inertia, and it made her pitch terribly, which is why we had such a miserable time beating down the Portuguese coast, and ever since, because Mike kept that mast, and I think that if he'd, I don't think he'd ever have done it, but if he'd put a carbon fibre mast on it, it would have transformed her performance. Mm-hmm. Because now we know from tank tests and things that the pitch inertia of a boat has a huge influence on the actual pitching when you're heading into head seas. So although that saved us in terms of it didn't cost much and got us a very robust mast, it did compromise her performance, though we didn't know that at the time.
Interesting. Colin, there's a few more questions on the Q&A. Somebody's asking, where is Cooya now?
don't honestly know. Obviously, after Mike died, his widow Eileen set about selling her. She tells me that she did sell Cooya to a man in Wiltshire who has got her in a shed somewhere in Wiltshire and is rebuilding her. So hopefully another lease of life for what is still basically a very sound hull.
Another 100 years.
More or less completely refastened her in bronze.
Gosh.
So the basic hull is very, very solid.
Yeah. Question about aluminium boats. They're becoming very fashionable in the high latitudes now with the Boreals and the Ovnis. I always wonder about corrosion, and everybody always seems to be fretting about painting their decks and all that sort of stuff. They seem to be expensive to maintain. No, I mean, well, most of the paint is purely aesthetic. You're better off to, I mean, if I were going to high latitudes, I'd strip it all off, I think. You don't need it. The aluminium doesn't need it. It's just to make it look nice. And also one of the problems is that when it bubbles, it actually traps water underneath and actually then causes corrosion. Sure. So on my boat, one of the jobs I got in the back of my mind is a few places where the paint's bubbling. I need to scrape it back before it does any harm. Yeah. But the paint systems are not that different to anything else. Yeah. They're no different really to steel. And I mean, I know it's a trivial thing, but to me, one of the great things about an aluminium boat compared to steel is I can drill holes in it and I can tap things into it, which of course you can do in steel, but there's no problem with all the swarf going rusty. Okay. It sounds silly, but when you drill holes in steel boats, you always end up with bits of metal going somewhere and you can't find them. Next thing you know, there's a great long rust streak. Mm-hmm. So from that sense, aluminium is a much more practical material. Yes, you can get electrolysis, but on something like an Ovni, there's a leak detection meter, which are readily available. And so if you have one of those, you can be pretty confident that you're not getting this problem. You're just careful not to drag cables through. Well, you don't really tend to have a wet bilge, of course, but then that's no different to a fiberglass boat. But you're just careful to keep cables so they don't get damp, and ideally put them in conduit. You can't always do that, but try to do that and route them as high as you can. Anything that might possibly cause a stray current. And so everything, obviously everything is double connected. It always comes back to a negative and goes to the batteries. And ways of completely disconnecting the batteries. Shore power causes people problems, I think. So I would never leave an aluminium boat long term with shore power on. I mean, I do use shore power in the marina, but I prefer to have a pretty much self-sufficient boat anyway. So she will shortly have a lot of solar on. So you don't really need power even in a marina. But it's nice to have hot water occasionally, but I'm getting soft in my old age. that's what you should. And people worry about things like, dropping a penny in the bilge and stuff. I mean, I think that's an urban myth. I did have a confession from one guy who had I think it was an Ovni actually, who had put some, I don't know why he got hydrochloric acid on his boat and why he stored it in the locker in his heads. Well, yeah. But the inevitable happened, and it trickled down the back and corroded through below the waterline. I think he was very, very, very red-faced about it. I mean, come on. No, all understandable. And I imagine, urine possibly could do the same. So I am a bit careful about keeping the toilet well watered, should we say, flushed through. I think the painting thing is an issue. I've been on a couple of Boreals and they've not been around so long, and all of them, the ones of a certain age anyway, had got bubbling paint on their top sides, which was going to cost a fortune to get sorted. So I'm not quite sure why they are painting them. Are the Ovnis painted at all above deck on the deck? Yes, and the one I've got was one of the reasons I bought it was because it had been repainted in 2014. Right. And it was built in 1999. So, I mean, maybe the paint jobs only last 15 years or so. I don't know. I mean, the previous one I had was a bit older.
and I'd repainted the top sides and indeed repainted the decks. But it's, you know, the repainting is not that difficult. You've got to use the right undercoat and things.
Yeah.
But I don't see why it's that much different to steel. I mean, obviously compared to fiberglass, yes. Yeah. But I think the issues with paint and things, I've got a friend who's got a half-scale Thames barge, which is steel, and he's forever having to stick paint on that thing. And also gets worried about corrosion because, you know, you do tend to get corrosion on steel, which you can't see. And you can end up with the corrosion eating through the steel, because that tends not to happen on aluminium.
Question on the Q&A from Terence Brownrigg. I don't know if you can see that, Colin. I wonder if you, it's at the bottom of the Q&A. It says, I wonder if you would put out your fisherman's anchor, you could have stopped or at least seriously reduced your rolling. Wouldn't work very well. Large rise and fall in the tide. An angel. This is your episodes of rolling in the Azores and Madeira, wasn't it?
I can't see that on the chat, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the other speaker's suggestion of putting out a stern anchor and turning around and turning, because there wasn't much wind. It wasn't as if we needed to lie to the anchor because of the wind conditions. Yeah. What I should have done was to put another line out and turned around, head into the waves. It was a fairly regular swell. Yeah. You know, and again, I do that now because I've learned the hard way.
Terence, his bottom last sentence says, incidentally, I know both Eileen and her son well. That's Mike's wife. That's nice.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well, give her my regards. I've sort of lost touch, but I keep in touch with her boys. But one of them was going to buy an Ovni recently, but decided not to in the end.
Okay. More, I guess, comment rather than question. Great presentation. Annalie Nilsson says, interesting, I sailed from Florida to the Grenadines in 1981, mostly the same conditions now, sailing in the Caribbean. Yeah. I'm from Sweden, so good multinational audience. Brian O'Flynn, who I think must be Irish, says we sailed into Santa Maria in the Azores some years ago and were royally entertained by a uniformed drumming band. Quite spectacular display.
Oh yeah. There's a question from Rosie Rigby about Tyler.
Yes.
I'm afraid I can't remember, but if you Google Cooya, one of the various sites that come up has got her history, which Mike and I helped him with a bit. Mike and I wrote, and that will tell you which Tyler it was and tells you more about it. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Great. But yeah, as I say, he was obsessed with fiberglass, so he sheathed a bit of the mast and also covered the decks. And then we had a hell of a job because because polyester resin doesn't stick to wood, which people didn't know back then. Of course, water gets under the edges because they didn't put it properly under the covering board and everything because they thought it would stick, which it didn't.
Great. I think we've probably come to the end, Colin. Those guys that had their hand up haven't opened their microphone up. I'll give them one last chance to unmute, which is Stephen Feltner or Charles Stark.
There's one that says, what peculiarities can you share with us about your aluminium vessel? Was that the question we had earlier? Sorry,
I kind of paraphrased that and we just went on a conversation about aluminium, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think we're done. You've been talking for an hour and a half, or the best part of anyway, Colin. So thank you very, very much indeed. It's been a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed the 1970s journalism, to be honest. And there's completely un-PC comments. And what was their target audience with them marketing it with all that kind of amazing, like those kind of car shows of the 1970s.
We sort of sat in the office in Camper Nicholson saying, oh, look at it. This one will get them.
Phenomenal. No, great talk, good audience, and we're looking forward to your next talk, Colin. Okay. I will post up the recording in the next 24 hours probably, and they usually probably get about as many hits as have been on tonight. So altogether, you'll have probably spoken to a good few hundred people. Lots of names I don't recognise, so I don't think they're all OCC by a long chalk, which is excellent.
Yeah, it's good.
And, look forward to seeing you. I think, is it 2 or 3 weeks' time? I can't remember.
Something like that. Sorry. Yeah, I know I'm doing it.
And I'm completely feckless with my timetabling of the series.
Yeah, sure.
But, thank you very much, and I'll sign off. Good night, everybody.
There's 3 new messages. Yeah, they're all just very kind. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone,
Very
for
much
listening.
from Ireland. All the best. Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Pat.
Thanks. Yeah, and your kind messages. Thank you.
I'll forward all this to you anyway.
I'll give a talk anytime you want to talk if you're stuck.
Pat, you booked. Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'll sign off.
Thank you very much.